This is CEC Gurukul live lecture series, and we are running a series of lectures on romantic trend in English writing. And as you all know, there have been 2 or 3 lectures earlier, and we are now in the middle of it. We'll be discussing sometimes the texts, sometimes we'll talk about certain aspects, sometimes we'll be talking also about the background of romantic thought and romantic writing. That will depend on the relevance of the particular thing that we present here. And for today's lecture, which is on Wordsworth's Tintern Abbey, that famous poem, we have our expert, Dr. Richa Bajaj, who teaches English literature in Hindu College, Delhi University. She has worked on Indian writing in English. She also worked on feminism and modern poetry. And she has done books. There is a book in her name on Mukti Bodh, the Hindi writer, the Hindi poet of the 20th century. And apart from that, she has attended conferences and presented papers. So I welcome Dr. Richa Bajaj.
Thank you.
And
Thank you.
now, because she would be talking on Wordsworth's Tintern Abbey, I am also curious to know as to what she has to say, because this is the poem with which all of us who are scholars, who are students of literature, who study literature seriously, we have grown up with this poem. And this is an autobiographical poem, as Dr. Richa Bajaj will tell you. And some people think that this poem, Dr. Richa Bajaj, is that correct, that this poem is let's say the prelude in the seed form or some such thing? You can perhaps talk about that if you feel like. And please give your basic statement and then we talk.
Yes, I think of course, you see, it is autobiographical and it has a lot to do with the poet's relationship with nature, and also then how he represents, how he understands that relationship and projects it in poetry. So it's and Wordsworth has been in that sense has been discussed so much, and there is so much that has been written on him that one doesn't know how much to bring in a lecture. And therefore I thought that without going into the criticism that exists on Wordsworth, I should go to the text itself and find some, and just start from the text itself and find meaning there, rather than going around, because so much has been connected. Because this poem is understood to be an autobiographical one, so there are so many connections that are constantly made between the place, the place and the poetry, or Wordsworth's life and the work that exists. I didn't want to go into these areas, and I thought that let's look at the poem and discuss that.
Very refreshing.
Yes.
When you look at the poem and from there you come to certain conclusions,
yes,
then that is more refreshing than talking about the background and all. I agree
yes,
with you.
because so much of criticism is around Wordsworth that I think that what he didn't want to do in his poetry, that is to dull the senses, that is what is the result when you read too much. Because Wordsworth essentially is a poet who's with whom you find a connect, and there is a kind of a bond that you build, but with a lot of criticism around.
Tell us about your bond with Wordsworth.
Yeah, because you see, I think Wordsworth's poetry is known to have, some people have interpreted it as having healing powers. And in fact, as early as in 18th century itself, first there was Matthew Arnold in fact talked about the healing power of that kind of poetry, and how poetry makes sense for us and helps us interpret the world and make us see better things. So in that sense, I think that Wordsworth is known to have a kind of a healing power.
It talks about you, it sets you at rest.
Yes,
it gives
it heals you, to very simply put. This kind of a poem, it actually heals, and it actually brings some these basic, some essential joys to your life, and those
Healing
are connected
is a slightly problematic part.
Yes.
Does it calm one down? Does it set one thinking? Does it give a sense of feeling? What exactly is the effect of this poem on the reader's mind, if I may ask? I can give you my own version of what impact it has, but then what do you say?
See, I mean, I feel that this poem, I mean, if we don't want to use the word healing, then there is a sense that, you know, it brings you back to your own self. It makes you connect to your own self in that sense. And in that sense, it, you know, it becomes, it gives you answers to questions that probably you hadn't thought of. And the way to come back to oneself is also through the calming effect, or if you want to use the word calming, then the calming effect that nature has, because nature brings you back to your primal instincts, and to bring you back, and it brings you back to who you essentially are. And that person, you know, as Wordsworth visualizes, that person gets lost in the city, loses oneself in the city, in that and in its din. But when one returns in this kind of solitude, or a kind of when one undergoes this kind of recollection, as he says, of past events, then one is achieves a kind of so to speak, a kind of an enlightenment, if one could use that word as well. So it is reaching that kind of essence, or you could say an understanding about one's own self.
In fact, I would welcome the word healing also, because after all, in the latter half of the 18th century and early part of the 19th century, people really felt hurt by what happened in the cities. And if somebody went into the lap of nature, spent time there, then definitely even one felt calmed down.
Yeah, and soothed, and at the same time sane. I think that's the word that Wordsworth also uses, that, you know, it is, poetry is meant to bring out the permanent aspects of one's life and to keep one sane in this escalating kind of industrialization, or the values that come along with it, you know, which are based on profit and selfish attributes and self-interest. So in that, how does one connect with anybody else? So it's like a jaya then, and when one is out of it, when he's out of it, then this kind of a poem actually brings him back to his own self, and again, as he says, that it lightens his moods and brings joys that he had lost when he went out to the city, went into the city. So I think that's the kind of a reading that, to begin with, one can have of Tintern Abbey.
I expect quite a bit from you on this, and you could give an idea.
Viewers, let's have a brief view of who Wordsworth was really. Where did he grow up? When was he born? So let's look at some of the details on your slide as well. You will find that there is let's look at the slides. Born in 1770, then Wordsworth is born in the Lake District. It's supposed to be a beautiful place in northern England, and he's surrounded by you know, beautiful landscapes. He studied in Cambridge and visited several parts of Europe over a period of time. And several times, in fact, he went to different places. So he was in touch with you know, different cultures at the same time. And he lost his parents at an early age of 13, and his uncles actually looked after the family, the 5 Wordsworth siblings. Among these, his sister Dorothy, whom he also mentions in Tintern Abbey, he was very close to her, and she was only a year younger than Wordsworth. So that's the picture of William Wordsworth, if you can see it on your slide. That's the picture of the man, and this is the place where he was born, the Lake District, the area. There are many pictures, you can go around and see it's the place as well. Let's look at other details of his life then. So he went at school, then Wordsworth learnt grammar, and he learnt the 18th century poetry, and joined Cambridge in 1787. So initially he actually thought he would study to enter the church, but that he left midway and didn't go through this. And so by 1790 he had become a very curious poet, and this is just a year after the French Revolution, which took place in 1789. So Wordsworth, in fact, with a friend, took a walking tour of France along with other places such as Switzerland and Germany, and this is the time when he actually comes face to face with the kind of upheaval that is taking place in France, and it impresses him and he's able to participate in that joyous moment of the country. So he had very high hopes. The revolution inspired him, and he wrote the kind of writing that he intended to create was based on the ideals of the French Revolution, in fact. So this actually constitutes the golden period of Wordsworth's writing from 1789 to 1806. This is the period which is considered the golden period of his writing. After this, the terror of the French Revolution, the terror within quotes, I mean, that's how it's generally understood, and the happenings in the country, in France as also in England, because England and France were at war, and all this left him disillusioned, in fact. So there is a kind of a decline that sets in later as well. But then in 1795, he and his sister Dorothy, they settled in Dorset along the English Channel, that is. And it was during this period that Wordsworth met Coleridge, and they became good friends, and the two collaborated to bring out the famous lyrical ballads. And the preface of it is the preface to the lyrical ballads of 1798 is actually a kind of a manifesto of romantic literature, and it brings out what the poets set out to do, how they plan to do it, what would be the subject of their poetry, and what would be the language and the style they'd use. So, and in this particular preface to lyrical ballads, this is as important and becomes a very good background for understanding Tintern Abbey, in fact. Here Wordsworth actually outlines the role of a poet as well in contemporary society, and he put a lot of score to the idea of the poet, and he believed that a poet had a great role to play in such tumultuous times. So with this, Wordsworth and Coleridge, they worked together, but then when differences arose, the friends parted ways. Then Wordsworth moved back to the Lake District in 1799, and in 1802 he married Mary Hutchinson, who was Dorothy's friend. And in 1813 he took up a government job. In 1843 he was made poet laureate. This is that's the kind of it's the close towards the close of his life. He becomes a poet laureate. He's a well-known poet and well established. So obviously he has fit into the canon, so to speak, so that he has turned into a kind of a well-established poet. So we can see that he's moved to the more normative, as against his initial career where he rebelled against both poetic styles and that were being or poetry that was written by 18th century writers. A
question occurs to me at this point in the discussion, and that question is regarding the two choices that he had, let's say in the 1780s. One choice was the church, the other choice was to take interest in the French Revolution. So he chooses French Revolution over the church.
Initially he set out to study to enter the church, actually.
Enter the church, but then the other choice occurs within 2 years, and then he goes and joins it.
Right.
And he spends some time there. He has full affinity with the social cause there, which means from religion to secularism is a kind of jump that he takes happily.
Right.
And after that he never looks back. As you rightly point out, in the 1805, 1810, 1813, he is moving further towards the power of the state, of which he will become a part. But he will never get back to church or to God.
Right.
So his teacher, his master would then be at the most nature.
Yes, but when you speak of God in Wordsworth, he, of course, in the Tintern Abbey, he says that I'm a worshipper of nature. But then also later on, when somebody asked him, he said, well, that was just in the moment and a passionate kind of an expression. I don't believe in that idea of worshipping. So that is it there. But I think that Wordsworth, in terms of religion and God, if one had to talk about that, it was very close to Milton. He actually he was inspired, he drew inspiration from Milton and Milton's epic Paradise Lost. So in many ways the main theme of Tintern Abbey, if you look at it, then it's all about the past glory that is irretrievable, and the present, which carries, which has toil, which has labor, which has work, and is fraught with problems, is dull, there is suffering involved in the present, and yet the present is valuable for its own meaning. So in Tintern Abbey, there is always this kind of there is movement from time past to time present to visualizing a future. And here the poet is not nostalgic or doesn't bemoan the fact that the past is lost. He doesn't want to return to that stage of childhood. In fact, as an adult, he realized that nature has brought him new gifts and other gifts, he says.
So instead of nostalgia, he would like to accept nature as it is.
So there is thought. In the present, there is thought and there is thinking, there is acceptance of what is lost, and yet a kind of fulfillment in understanding, and very close to Paradise Lost in that sense, where the paradise is lost, and yet what
people make sense of their present.
Right. What Milton wanted to project was that it's not as bad. It's not like we are fallen and gone. So there is life and there is meaning, and there is meaning through human effort. So in that sense, the emphasis on human capabilities, on human effort, I think is what keeps Wordsworth secular.
This is a good point you are making. A kind of.
He takes the Miltonic tradition further in the. That's what I think. He takes the Miltonic tradition further.
When the fall occurs, then people are thrown onto the earth.
And imagine that, you see, even for Adam and Eve, once the fall has taken place, they can't connect, they can't go back to God. God becomes a kind of a force that is now inaccessible, and so they must go through the archangels, right? And so in Wordsworth too, the poet must access that which is enlightened through nature. So there is an intermediary involved, both the nature in the case of Wordsworth, and the archangels in the case of
So
Adam
the human
and Eve.
being may not get back father, but human being has got a mother.
Yeah,
in the form of nature.
Yes, in the form of nature, and of course Wordsworth very clearly calls nature the nurse, guide and friend. So in that sense, the guide and friend is what the archangels were for Adam and Eve. So in that sense, I feel that he is working around that model, and in that, a lot of critics have actually claimed that Tintern Abbey is a kind of a moral landscape, or is a kind of a moral, could be called a moral epic in the making, kind of a moral landscape which is projected here. It's the whole poem seems to be about nature, but it is actually not. It is all about the moral landscape of the poet.
What does moral landscape stand for?
That's it. So that's exactly is what one may think of. So the moral landscape is actually one of the critics. I think Shobhana Bhattacharya, she's at one place mentions that it's a kind of a moral landscape. So it set me thinking that yes, maybe it's about the spiritual journey of the poet, and also a landscape perhaps because it fits in well, and it becomes a good metaphor for one's own life inside, because Wordsworth also in the poem keeps mentioning to that presence inside me, or that presence that is sublime, in the sense that can't be explained. So there is a sense that there is an inner life that the poet is leading, and it is based on, and there is a moral compass that he has, not moral compass which is set by or which is guided by religion, but one which is guided by nature and the primal instinct at which you connect with all human forms or all living forms.
That you have a kind of sense of selfhood, and that selfhood is nourished and matured by the company of nature.
Yes.
So that way the sense of self is what morality is for him.
Yes, I would think that is the case. So
there are no norms, there are no principles to follow. If there is any principle, that principle would have its source in nature.
I think so, because you see what Wordsworth also believes, because there is any kind of organization, is then seen to be in the city. City becomes the kind of representation of social organization. That is in fact Raymond Williams in his essay The City and the Country and the City actually says that there is a kind of Wordsworth, when he goes to the city, then he carries his country experience with him, and his opinion is shaped by all that he went through or all that he is because of the country. And he says that he realizes in the city that social organization is actually plays the role of the dominant and controls human beings, while this country lets him be and keeps him free, by that logic. So, in that sense, yes, there are
You
principles
mean
are to be found.
energy that the person gets from the village, that energy has a kind of path that is there in front of the poet, and the outer controlling authority of the society is not needed.
Right.
What is needed is the kind of
Inner
energy
logic,
that will
yes.
flow
And there
in
is
a certain
and there's a
direction.
natural rhythm
Yes.
that the poet goes with, unlike the principled or the set of principles that are followed and that are meant to then, as Raymond Williams says, play the role of the dominant in the city, and therefore it exercises control on the human
So you
being.
might use the word guide, but he doesn't need a guide. The guide is inside himself. So this is the flow along with which he will go, and he will learn new things. So nature, Tintern Abbey, you will be, I think, talking about the text also later. Then in that also the word guide is used, but guide is actually within oneself.
Right.
This is the way you want to adopt, and there is something inside you that tells you that this is where you feel happy and sane, as you say.
Same,
to use
yes,
your word.
that is certainly the case.
Mhm.
So, let's try and understand what other people are also saying about the Romantic age and about Wordsworth as well. Let's try and understand that. You know, M.H. Abrams in his essay, The Use of Romantic Poetry, claims, and I quote, you should be able to see the slide there, to Plato, poetry had been bad because it aroused the emotions, and to Aristotle, poetry or at least tragedy had been good because it purged the emotions. To the Wordsworthian, poetry, because it strengthens and refines the emotions, is among the greatest of goods. Emphases are of course mine, but what I want you to look at here is how in Wordsworth or for Wordsworth, poetry actually strengthens and refines the emotions. Interesting. What is strengthening and refining the emotion?
Refining maybe in the sense, you know, that when a feeling becomes aware of itself, and then you know you get feeling itself gets a kind of life, and the life, you know, starts showing a kind of direction, and that is different from raw feeling. So feeling is not raw, and you are
Right.
using the word refined there.
Yes.
So if there is something that is wavered in it, if there is some anarchy in it, then maybe nature intervenes. But if there is no anarchy, then it becomes smooth and spontaneous.
Right. So, the point is that it strengthens also the emotion. So, poetry
yes.
strengthens emotion. What would
Enriches, strengthens, makes it more satisfying, more fulfilling. These are your words.
Right.
And I think these words carry within them a kind of direction that we have to accept.
Yes. So, in a way he sees that there is power in poetry, and poetry actually refines people's emotions. It gives them a sense of pattern, perspective, and sharpens their sense of their feeling as well. So, that's something that one has to. So, he's actually talking about this texture of emotion, you know, and that is why no wonder Wordsworth actually called this a kind of a science of feeling. He called poetry a science of feeling. How would you look at that?
These two words are very problematic. Refined means, you know, that it's not natural in another sense.
Yes.
When you take something raw, then you want to, you know, protect that rawness in it. But no, not for Wordsworth. Wordsworth would like to go into it and then make it still better than it was.
Yes.
So he believes
I
in
don't
refinement.
think there is a contradiction in the sense of refinement or raw, because what he seems to be suggesting is that emotions are refined when one is in touch with nature. Yes, so it's not like the raw emotions is something that he projects when he was a child. You know, when he was a child and he ran wild, he was like a deer. He ran. You know, he went around places. So that is the raw, or what he calls, in fact, in the poem, he calls coarser pleasures. So as against pleasing thoughts that he has later. So the coarser pleasures actually, you know, suggest that they are raw, as against to the refined self that he attains as an adult.
Maybe the metaphor also goes in the direction of the human life. In the beginning, one is a child, and the child is coarser in that sense. The child doesn't have that kind of raw thought,
Right.
the other thought. And when this thought occurs, you know, when you are adult, when you start wondering about the world, then it's a different kind of emotion. So that's what perhaps Wordsworth means. So as you are pointing towards it. So refinement, culture, these are the words that become positive. But then there might be problems with the romantic criticism. But the word romantic is something, you know, that will create problems. But anyway, I think the version that you are giving is a very, very rewarding kind of a version, and we should, I should share, you should share more with me and the viewers.
So there's just one more quote I thought of from M.H. Abrams that you can look at, viewers. He says that in contrast to Johnson, Wordsworth, instead of telling and demonstrating what to do, become better. Poetry, by sensitizing, purifying and strengthening the feelings, directly makes us better.
Which means that this quote also has in mind some kind of the ethos that was there in the 18th century. The words are taken from there and then they are adapted to the requirements of the early 19th century.
Right.
Maybe that's the case.
The idea is that poetry, by sensitizing, purifying, and strengthening the feelings, directly make us better, according to Wordsworth. So while the Augustan age poetry believed in telling how to become better, Wordsworth believed in bettering through the very use of poetry, bettering the individual not by telling the person what to do, but by presenting certain things in poetry that would automatically make him refine his self. So the idea is, I think that way the aim of Wordsworth's poetry is also to take out what he calls this generation out of what he calls savage torpor. Which is caused by the Industrial Revolution. You see, there is this thing that the Romantic poets came at a time when they had on one end they saw the French Revolution, and Wordsworth lived throughout that period, through the reign of the French Revolution, through the entire period, and on the other hand, they had the Industrial Revolution to cope with at home, so which was already creating a lot of dislocation, a kind of a social dislocation, and a kind of a churning and migration that was taking place. So while more and more people occupied the city became inhabitable, and yet the necessity to be returned to the city for many, and with that the ideals that the French Revolution had, and followed by the disillusionment that many writers faced. So this was a period where thought, ideas and a poet's role somehow for a writer like Wordsworth became very important. So that is something that I thought is interesting and to keep in mind while we discuss and analyze.
What form does this take in the text of the poem? This particular thing. That's the query that one would like to.
Yes. So a couple of things that I thought we should look at before we actually go to the poem, and it's certain things. Just certain basic points that I think we should remember how that poem is progressing. So one, of course, you see the evolution of the self that takes place in the course of the poem, which happens along both categories of time and space. So time and place play an important role in this particular poem. So if that is one point. The second is how the past, time present, time past and time future are projected. Third, of course, at the level of place as well, how the place, when we speak of the place, then of course we are referring to the city and the countryside, how the writer is building a relationship and negotiating his relationship with each, and what is his final assessment of his life. Then
time then means reference to childhood. Then to the process of maturity.
I was coming to that. So at the level of self or selfhood, there is the child and there is the adult, and in between there is a young adult whom he visualizes in the form of Dorothy. So you see, we need to see all these categories when we are looking at the poem. Let's first, for you viewers, there is a representation of Tintern Abbey on the screen. If you'd like to, what is Tintern Abbey? It's of course the place, Tintern Abbey, which is the Tintern village, next to it the abbey, which is a religious or a place of religion where religious activities take place. So this is another image of the place, Tintern Abbey, where he and Dorothy both go on a tour. Now when you look at the title, you just see what the title is. Just look at the title itself. It says, lines composed a few miles above Tintern Abbey on revisiting the banks of the Wye during a tour, July 13, 1798. Now, the title itself is very long, first of all, for any poem or any title. We obviously now refer to the poem as Tintern Abbey, but why didn't Wordsworth, who constantly edited his poem, why is it that Wordsworth never just call it, why didn't he just call it Tintern Abbey? In fact, a Wordsworth biographer tells us that this is one poem that he wrote in a flow, and he in fact did very little editing to this poem. It just went straight away the way it was written in the first go. So it was, it in fact then becomes an example of this powerful overflow of powerful feelings that Wordsworth talks about in the preface to Lyrical Ballads. Now look at the title itself. Here, lines composed a few miles above Tintern Abbey. So it's like the poem is still in the making. These are lines which are composed a few miles. Why is the person so meticulous to give us details above Tintern Abbey on revisiting the banks of the Wye during a tour, July 13, 1798? The poet is giving you the exact day when it was written, the year when it was written, where it was written, along which bank it was written. So in a way, this poem actually is a kind of a diary entry of the poet and could be seen as a kind of a personal journal then. And Wordsworth could have edited it and kept those details out, but he did not. He wanted this poem to be a kind of a personal journal, to be represented as a kind of, say, a kind of a diary that he's bringing for the reader to read and witness his life. So
and
that
it also gives a sense of place.
Yes.
The person is all the time talking about these things, wild
Yes.
ways and all.
Yes, and also he calls it while going during a tour, which could we also see it as a kind of an example of travel writing, a
Yes.
travel poem. So you see the idea of revisiting. You see the idea of he has been here, he is revisiting. So the very title itself tells you that this poem is about revisitation, or is about going back to the place that one has been in life. So again, that kind of title itself has a lot to tell us about the very form of the poem.
One can say, lightheartedly, that the title continues into the first lines.
Exactly,
when it talks about 5
that's
years.
true. Yes, 5 years have passed.
Yes.
And if you just notice then how the poem goes on, so you know that he's talking about, he's not just telling you that time has passed, he's telling you the length of time, yes, with the length of 5 long winters. So of course, he's not even content to just say 5 years. He wants to go on to impress the point that those 5 years have been very long, and therefore this kind of repetition that you see here on time past. So he's referring to time past, and then he goes on to say 5 years have passed, 5 summers with the length of 5 long winters, and again I hear. So the idea of again, that will keep coming in the poem. So he's constantly thinking of, there are 2 time periods then here. One that is his present. 2 is that moment when he lived and when he was present before this time, and therefore the again here. And the 3rd is how he remembers that past today. So how he lived in that past time, and how he lives today, how he understands, and how he understands and what he remembers of that past time. So in a way, along with these 2, he's also reconstructing his past. He's reconstructing deliberately in memory, where certain things are stored and others have have gone away. It is this moment that he's trying to capture.
And this connect at the level of emotion, at the level of memory.
Right.
And once again, you are constantly looking at 2 things simultaneously.
And he's constantly going back to his earlier self,
Yes.
what he was, and that earlier self and what that earlier self thought of the world around gives him a better understanding of what he is today. So he's constantly moving from this time past and present.
It's a kind of presenting as in a film. This is the child, this is a young man, and this is the time between.
Yes.
And this person will become that young man later.
Yes. Could you think that stream of consciousness perhaps would have taken some points from here?
Definitely, in the sense that when one does a kind of journey into oneself at the level of selfhood, how one became as against nature.
Right.
Nature was all the time entering into this. So you are right. There is a kind of stream of consciousness as a basis for perceiving the atmosphere that is in front of him.
That's correct. So let's go back to the poem. So he says, then he talks about the waters, the rolling from the mountain springs with a soft inland murmur. Once again, the word again will keep coming. So once again, I behold these steep and lofty cliffs. So you see, the idea is that he beheld these lofty cliffs at one point in time as a child, and now as an adult. What is the difference between these two views and these two kind of viewpoints that he has today? And then he goes on to again talk about that on a wild secluded scene impress thoughts of more deep seclusion. So the idea of more deep, what in fact what existed in childhood was at a more surface level. Now it has become more deep as an adult, so it is more precious. Even as the poem seems to be ruining or talking about a time past, it is actually he's actually suggesting here how the experience today is more deep.
I also think that the place is becoming very solidly into the mind of the author, because he's talking about those cliffs, he's talking about the streams, he's talking about greenery.
Right.
So you can see that, you can in fact smell the place.
Right.
It's that kind of a feeling.
That way it has the imagery is quite evocative. In fact, he uses the auditory, that I hear, I see, I behold. So the visual, the auditory and the tactile, all these images are constantly woven and they bring alive that particular scene
and
for us.
And one can't think of such a poem being written in the 18th century by those rationalists and Augustines.
Yes, of course.
They couldn't have written this kind of poem.
Because Wordsworth gets into the skin of that place, or becomes that place, which of course Keats later would refine in his poetry, but for Wordsworth, he's not outside that scene. He's
I think this is what is healing. This is what is calming. That one is so sensuous that one is enjoying the company of nature, the company of the place,
and one is able to look at oneself as an extension of that place and not an outsider.
Yes.
And that's the basic difference between the 18th century poetry and Wordsworth, because Wordsworth feels the very there
is a total identification of the person with nature.
That is true.
At one point of time, it appears, that the nature actually is the way the poet's mind is working.
Exactly. In fact, he says that when he mentions here in the poem, he says that they are, which at this season, he's talking about the cottage ground, the orchard tufts, etc. And he says they are all clad in one green hue, suggesting that all is one color. There is no place has a kind of, identity or a separate specific identity. They are all one.
Yes.
Yeah. So they reach even the homes. When he says that they are all clad in one green hue and they lose themselves, he says they are clad in one green hue and lose themselves amid groves and copses. Once again, I see these hedgerows, hardly hedgerows, little lines of sportive wood run wild.
There is a kind of life that he can visualize in nature.
And even when he's talking about the hedgerows and he says their sportive wood has run wild.
Already
there's life,
sporting.
It's breathing, it's throbbing and it's moving. So things
and wild also suggests movements.
Right,
wild is not just a forest.
Exactly, and that's what he was. So as a child he was all this and a part of this life. So he talks about these, how the sportive would run wild. So again, that's one of the references. Again, when he refers to the vagrant dwellers in the houseless woods, suggesting that houses belong to the city, whereas here in the countryside, here in the woods, it is all houseless. And he imagines that there might be a hermit who's sitting by the fire and he sits alone. So he becomes that hermit and also that vagrant dweller, in fact. So that's how the poem progresses. Now, if you look at these beauteous forms, when he says these beauteous forms through a long absence have not been to me as is a landscape to a blind man's eye, suggesting that this long absence has not created fissures, has not broken the bond between the natural
Has been in company all the time.
Yes, and he says that no, it's not like the landscape, this long absence has not caused me to turn into a blind man. I have still had nature in my lonely rooms, he says. So through a long absence, they have not been to me as a landscape to a blind man's eye. In fact, in my lonely rooms, he says, amid the din of towns and cities, I have owed to them in hours of weariness and sensation sweet, felt in the blood and felt along the heart, and passing even into my purer mind with tranquil restoration, feelings too of unremembered pleasure. So the idea is that even in his lonely rooms or amid the din of the city that he visualizes, where he has stayed, of towns and cities, he has owed something to nature even in that time. So it's not like that relationship has seen some kind of a rupture.
One can even say that when he was in the cities, then he became blind to the aspects of life in the city, and his other eye would open, the eye that is there in nature,
right.
and that nature sustained him in the city.
That's exactly what he says, that the nature actually sustained me when everything around me was dull and vacant. It lit up a flame in me, and it lit up a joy in me. It lightened me and gave me thoughts of my earlier pleasures. So
would you call it the greatest poem of Wordsworth for this reason?
Well, I wouldn't want to put it in any kind of degree, but this absolutely is one of his best. Well, the Prelude's first book is very close to Tintern Abbey, and in fact could have been taken, some portions could have, it becomes a one big poem, in fact, Tintern Abbey along with the first book of the Prelude. But yes, it is true that when Wordsworth goes back to his childhood, then he's at his best. Whether it is in Tintern Abbey or it is in the first book of Prelude, when he goes to his childhood memories, then he is actually at his best. I think that is what I would like to say about Wordsworth's poetry. If we have
I would agree with you on this, that the kind of fervor, the kind of energy, the kind of excitement that is there in Wordsworth at the time he is in company of nature. That is not seen at other times.
Yes, and you see what happens in this poem is that he talks about the weariness, and then he talks about the tranquil restoration. He talks about unremembered pleasure, those things which he did not.
Restoration is healing. Actually.
Healing.
Yes.
And also, you see, unremembered pleasure in the sense that things that he did not earlier think of as pleasurable and were just a matter of course for him, now are a source of pleasure. That is another interesting aspect. As recollected. When he goes through that experience, when he thinks of them, then they become more pleasurable. And then he says that I have owed another gift. He talks about he's of course talking about kindness and of love of nature. Then he says to them I may have owed another gift of aspect more sublime. Again, the idea that it's sublime also suggests that it can't be understood entirely. That blessed mood that he's talking about. So it has given him a mood in which the burden of the mystery, in which the heavy and the weary weight of all this unintelligible world. So this unintelligible world, of course, of the city, which is, so it's actually ironic, it's too intelligible and therefore unintelligible.
No, in the other sense, that it's not worth.
It's not worth. That is also there. So this heavy, weary weight that he carries, with that he's got another mood. So this weight is lightened, that serene and blessed mood in which the affections gently lead us on.
And it is affections, not ideas.
Yes, that is also there. And therefore the science of feeling, feeling, emotion, which is there.
Yes.
But then, Wordsworth also suggests that they become a living soul in him. So the spiritual, that things, and then he says, in this particular part, he says, we see into the life of things. Now, we see into the life of things having life of their own, or how things work. That also gives him an understanding
they have
of
a life of their own. There is some source of energy there.
Right.
They create themselves.
Yes.
They exist in that kind of dynamic.
So he is obviously in the flow, but then in the poem he returns to his conscious self. He's left this kind of intoxication which he showed here, and then he says he talks about this, and then he says that if this be but a vain belief, and you know, the idea that that's what people might think. So again, he's become conscious of the world around, that if this be but a vain belief, yet oh how oft in darkness and amid the many shapes of joyless daylight, when the fretful stir unprofitable and the fever of the world have hung upon the beatings of my heart, how oft in spirit have I turned to thee. So
I think he has diagnosed the disease of the capitalism very well.
Very well, and very early.
Very early.
In life. And that's what he says, that this is unprofitable word. Also, he's taking a dig, I think, at the utilitarian viewpoint, because Bentham at one place says that, you know, it is, if passions are to be repressed and not excited in the industrial age. So that's why the use of the word profitable or unprofitable, you know, he's actually taking a dig at those people who think of poetry. So utilitarian viewpoint at that time actually thought poetry to be a luxurious trade. For them it was rich people's kind of work.
Indulgence.
Yes. And Wordsworth turned it into the folklorish and the rustic
and the necessity. Of the necessity of life, rather than
exactly, yes. And so and it is the serious, you see, I also feel that it is Wordsworth's seriousness that gives that kind of that gives that kind of genuine quality to his work. He is serious in what he's saying. He doesn't want to make a point to just rebel against a particular viewpoint or rebel against 18th century kind of poetry. In fact, many people have suggested that Wordsworth was born and bred on that tradition, because he went to Cambridge, and he's actually a product of the Augustan age, and so it's ironical that he writes in a different language. But I'd like to contest that, you know, he's born in an age does not mean that when he attains
to be bound by
that age. He has,
time.
Of course, there are certain ideas which have seeped into him. Maybe there are certain styles and poetic forms that he has learnt, and they are with him unconsciously or passively, but the man is consciously trying to choose another path.
Actually, 18th century Augustan poetry would not look towards itself. So when it started looking towards itself, then perhaps Romanticism is born. So this person is aware of himself, surrounded by all the thought structures.
But he is also aware that poets are required in this age. You see, it was also because of the utilitarians' attack on this kind of poetry that many romantic poets had to offer a defense of poetry, such as Shelley or even Wordsworth. So they had to and at the same time they had to justify and the very act of writing.
This is a very good point you are making. You know, that poetry seems to be surrounded by the inimical forces.
That's true.
And it has to defend itself.
It has to defend itself.
And poets are coming now with lots of arguments to tell people that this is the most valuable thing in life.
Yes, and it's a difficult task, because Wordsworth also brings to the fore the fact that a lot of pulp fiction, Gothic fiction is leading to what I initially said, to a savage torpor. So people have stopped thinking. People have stopped believing that there are more enlightened feelings and thoughts that can be achieved through poetry, and they have you know, lost themselves in this kind of world. So that's how I think one can.
So one can see a kind of 18th century. One can see utilitarians who are there around in the early 19th century, and people who understand the truth and the reality of these and want to say their own.
Yes, and you know, if I could just pick up a phrase from the poem Tintern Abbey itself, he talks about sad perplexity. I think that is what defines this industrial age. It is perplexing, and yet there is a kind of sadness.
Which literally is yet to come, but it has started moving in that direction.
That's true. So I think when he talks about present pleasures also, then he is visualizing about the future years when he may not be there, and he visualizes in Dorothy his younger self, and you know, he urges her to take his task further or forward in that sense, and build a connect with nature that he has built. So
since
even that is there.
we are approaching the end of the lecture, we have 5 minutes only.
Right.
So how would you like to sum up this poem in terms of its effect, in terms of the offerings that it makes for us?
I think the poet is evaluating, maybe is not there, but he is definitely weighing what the past has brought to him, and he understands the present in the context of his particular time, and he thinks that his childhood memories, his past, his connect with nature has made him a better human being today, and when he comes across, when he sees around him what he calls the still sad music of humanity, what he calls the kind of sadness, then he is able to also connect and broaden his scope of understanding to not just himself. So, to call this poem entirely autobiographical would also be erroneous, because this is as much about people, and he wishes to build that connect through him. That kind of connect that other people around him.
Would you call it a poem of hopefulness, of finding answers to the questions that the age?
Yes, certainly. Yes, he is quite hopeful despite this kind of sad perplexity and still sad music that he talks about. He is quite hopeful vis-a-vis the present, and he thinks that people can be led on to their affections, and they can be led on to realizing their gentle affections, and not be entirely guided by the industrial life.
So, how long will Romanticism live after this poem?
Yes, that is, so there are younger romantics who are going to take the task of Wordsworth forward, and they'll be around, they're going to bring this, you see, the French Revolution in a way impacted the romantics in a very big way, from Wordsworth on to Byron and Shelley. So, I think that Romanticism continues to live in various shades through these writers.
So, the 19th
but there
century
is of course none like Wordsworth in the entire
19th century, because the impact of this poem is going to live Romanticism.
Yes,
for quite
and
some
benefit
time.
from it
For quite some time.
Yes, even Matthew Arnold, as I mentioned, he actually says
in the latter half of the 19th century.
Matthew Arnold says that we need poetry to bring us back to life, and without it, he says that science is incomplete.
And some people in fact outlast Romanticism, people like W.B. Yeats. He is called the last romantic.
He is called the last romantics, yes. When Romanticism has gone,
almost gone.
That is true.
Which means that this poem is a source of energy. That energy will sustain social life for quite some time.
Yes.
I think that's a Dr. Richa Bajaj, thanks so much. That's the kind of statement that fills us with hope. And as we have been saying in other lecture series also, that this Romanticism also became a part of the Indian ethos through another source. And in that series, we had romantic poets in India in the 19th century, also in the 20th century, because India was industrialized not as much as England, but then it was moving in that direction. So, it's a very powerful poet, it's a very powerful poem, and Dr. Richa Bajaj has given us a perspective on it from which we can learn quite a few things. Thank you, Dr. Richa Bajaj, and viewers. You think about these questions, certain insights. I think you will find very valuable, and think more about it.